You loved me when you thought I had nothing, and that mattered more than anything else.
This is the story of a black African man, a billionaire in disguise, and the black African woman who loved him. Not for his wealth, but for his heart. She lived on the streets, unknown, humble, surviving day by day. She had nothing to give him, except her kindness. And yet, it was in that quiet, ordinary life that he would discover the extraordinary truth about love, loyalty, and the courage to be vulnerable. Before we continue, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Adebayo Kingston owned more of that city than most people would see in a lifetime. From the top floor of his penthouse office, he could see everything. The river cutting through the city like a silver scar. The traffic crawling endlessly. The lights blinking in patterns he had memorized long ago. Yet tonight the view meant nothing. He stood by the window, suit jacket draped over a chair, sleeves rolled up, staring out as if the city might finally explain why his chest felt so heavy. 35 years old. A self-made billionaire. A man others called fortunate. But fortune had become a strange thing. Beautiful to look at, impossible to touch. Behind him, the office was immaculate. Too perfect. The desk polished until it reflected the ceiling lights. Awards lined the shelves, each engraved with his name. Business magazines lay stacked neatly, their covers praising his vision, his discipline, his genius. Adebayo didn't recognize the man they celebrated. He walked back to his desk and picked up his phone. Dozens of missed calls. Messages from board members. Social invitations from people who wanted to be seen near him, not known by him. He didn't open any of them. Instead, he opened an old email thread, one he rarely allowed himself to read. A conversation from years ago, when his company was still a dream and not an empire. Back when his messages were full of uncertainty, hope, and raw honesty. Back when he still felt human. He closed the email quickly, his jaw tightening. Somewhere along the way, ambition had stopped being a tool and started becoming a cage. Earlier that week, during a private dinner with investors, he had stepped away from the table briefly. As he returned, he overheard their conversation. Careless, unguarded. "He's worth more than most governments," one had said. "Yes, but is he still flexible?" another replied. "We need him compliant." They laughed. Not once did they mention his ideas, his values, his fears. Only numbers. Only leverage. He remembered standing there, unseen, realizing that the room would not go silent if he vanished. Only recalculated. That realization stayed with him. Now, alone in the quiet hum of air conditioning and distant traffic, it pressed against his ribs. "When did this happen?" he whispered to the empty room. "When did I become something people owned?" He sat down slowly, rubbing his temples. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened window. Sharp eyes, composed posture, a man trained to never look uncertain. But beneath the surface lived exhaustion so deep it frightened him. He thought of the people around him. Assistants who laughed on command, partners who praised him in public and competed with him in silence, friends who vanished the moment the money stopped flowing. And then he wondered something dangerous. If all of this disappeared, if the money vanished, if his name meant nothing, would anyone still see him? The question echoed louder than the city outside. He stood abruptly, as if startled by his own thoughts, and began pacing the room. Each step felt like a countdown. His mind raced, not with fear but with clarity. What if he stepped outside the story the world had written for him? What if he removed every advantage, every shield, and faced humanity as just a man? The idea felt reckless, insane, and yet freeing. By dawn, his decision was no longer a thought. It was resolve. He would disappear. Not as a stunt. Not as an experiment to be measured by profit. But as a journey into truth. No security teams following at a distance. No assistants arranging his steps. No cards, no accounts, no recognition. He would walk the same streets others ignored him on. Eat what kindness allowed. Sleep where vulnerability was unavoidable. He wanted to know the answer to one question that money had never been able to buy. Who would care if he had nothing at all? As the first light of morning crept into the room, Adebayo Kingston picked up his phone one last time, not to call anyone but to power it off. For the first time in years, the silence felt honest. And somewhere deep inside him, a man who had been buried under success finally took his first breath. Amara's world existed far from glass towers and guarded gates. It lived in narrow streets where dust settled on everything, where generators hummed through the night, and where the rhythm of life was measured not in profits, but in survival. The outskirts of the city did not offer comfort, but they taught resilience with brutal honesty. She lived there, in a single-room home with cracked walls and a roof that sang softly when rain fell. There were no photographs hanging on the walls, only memories she carried in silence. Her parents had died when she was still learning how to braid her hair properly, leaving behind lessons too heavy for a child. Grief came early. Responsibility came earlier. No one sat her down to explain how to survive. Life simply demanded it. And so, Amara learned. She learned how to wake before sunrise while the air was still cool and forgiving. She learned how to wash rice until the water ran clear, how to stretch ingredients without stretching dignity. She learned which spices could turn simple food into something that felt like care. By the time the sun rose, her small wooden food stand was already alive. The pot lids clinked softly. Steam curled into the air. The scent of stew drifted down the road, catching the attention of tired workers, students, and drivers stuck in endless traffic. Rice, sometimes beans. It wasn't luxury, but it was honest. She sold just enough to pay rent, just enough to eat, just enough to hope quietly for something better. People knew her face, even if they didn't know her name. They greeted her with nods, small smiles, sometimes jokes. She listened more than she spoke, her laughter gentle, her presence steady. What Amara sold was not only food. She sold patience. She sold warmth. She sold dignity, served daily on chipped plates with care. And despite everything she had lost, kindness still lived comfortably inside her. That evening arrived like many others. The city roared as always, horns blaring, voices overlapping, footsteps rushing past her stand as if everyone were late to somewhere more important. The air smelled of dust, petrol, and cooking oil. She had nearly finished serving her last customers when she noticed him. He sat a short distance away, on the edge of the pavement where shadows gathered. Not asking, not calling out, not stretching his hand, just sitting. His clothes were worn, creased by time and hardship. The fabric looked tired, like it had known too many nights without rest. His shoulders were slightly hunched, not in defeat, but in quiet endurance. He wasn't looking at the food. He was looking at nothing. Their eyes met for only a moment. In that moment, Amara felt something stir, an ache she could not explain. It wasn't pity. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. She had seen hunger before. She had known it personally. But this was different. There was a loneliness in his gaze that went deeper than an empty stomach. A loneliness that felt familiar. A voice nearby broke the moment. "Leave him," someone muttered impatiently. "If you feed one, 10 more will come. We all have our problems." Amara said nothing. She turned back to her pot, scooped a full plate, rice generously placed, stew poured carefully so it didn't spill. She paused briefly, as if listening to her own heart. Then she walked toward him. Her footsteps were soft, but her intention was firm. When she placed the plate into his hands, his fingers trembled, not from weakness alone but from surprise. "Eat," she said simply. No long speech. No explanations. No conditions. Adebayo looked up at her as if she had spoken a language he had forgotten. For a second he didn't move. In his world, his former world, nothing was given freely. Everything came with contracts, expectations, and quiet calculations. But here, on a roadside, a stranger had offered him food without knowing his name, without caring who he was, without asking what he could return. Something tightened in his chest. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough from disuse. The words felt insufficient. As he ate, warmth spread through his body. Not just from the food, but from the simple fact that someone had seen him. Human moment. Small, fragile, and powerful. Amara watched from a distance, pretending to tidy her stand, though her attention never left him. She didn't smile proudly. She didn't expect gratitude. To her this was normal. Kindness did not need applause. As the evening wore on, the road grew quieter. Vendors packed up. The sky deepened into indigo. Yet Adebayo remained nearby, sitting patiently as if afraid the moment might vanish if he moved. Eventually, conversation found them, slow, cautious, unforced. He listened more than he spoke. She told him about her parents, how silence had filled the house after they were gone, about learning to rely on herself, about dreams she rarely spoke aloud because hope felt expensive. "One day," she said shyly, eyes lowered, "I want a small place of my own. Somewhere people can sit and feel safe." Adebayo nodded, absorbing every word. When it was his turn to speak, he chose carefully. "I used to have a lot," he said quietly. "But none of it taught me how to feel full." It was the truth, stripped of names and numbers. Days passed, and more. And he kept returning. Sometimes hungry, sometimes curious, sometimes just to sit in silence beside her stand as life passed them by. Amara shared her meals. She shared her stories. She shared her laughter. Without realizing it, she shared her heart. And Adebayo, once surrounded by everything, found himself learning something priceless from a woman who sold food and dignity by the roadside. He had come looking for truth. And it had found him first. Adebayo did not plan to return the next day, or the day after that. But his feet seemed to remember the road even when his mind tried to argue otherwise. Each morning, without thinking, he found himself drifting back toward the familiar scent of stew and the soft sound of Amara's voice calling out prices to passing customers. At first, he told himself it was about hunger. But hunger had long stopped being the reason. He came when the sun was high and the street buzzed with life. He came when dusk settled slowly and shadows stretched across the pavement. Sometimes he arrived early and waited. Other times, he lingered long after her pots had cooled. Amara noticed, but she never made him feel watched. Some days, he sat quietly on a wooden stool near her stand, listening as she greeted customers with patience she never seemed to run out of. He watched the way she measured food carefully so everyone felt satisfied, the way she smiled even when coins came up short. She did not complain. She adapted. And in her quiet strength, Adebayo saw something rare. They spoke in pieces at first. Small sentences, shared observations, simple questions with gentle answers. "What time do you start every day?" he asked once. "Before the city wakes," she replied. "If I don't hurry, life will hurry me." He laughed softly at that. As days passed, words became easier. Silence grew comfortable instead of awkward. They talked while she stirred pots, while customers waited, while traffic slowed and surged like a restless tide. Amara spoke of nights when loneliness pressed too heavily on her chest, of returning home to a quiet room where only her thoughts waited, of learning to encourage herself when no one else did. "I tell myself tomorrow will be kinder," she said once, wiping her hands on her apron. "Some days it listens. Some days it doesn't." Adebayo absorbed every word as if storing them carefully inside himself. He had spent years in rooms filled with people who talked endlessly, yet said nothing real. Here on a roadside, truth flowed naturally. When it was his turn to speak, he chose honesty without exposure. "I used to be surrounded," he said one evening, his voice low. "People everywhere. Noise everywhere. But I felt unseen." Amara glanced at him, curiosity flickering in her eyes, but she didn't interrupt. "I woke up every day pretending I knew my purpose," he continued. "And every night I felt further from myself." She nodded slowly. "Sometimes," she said gently, Life gives you things before it gives you meaning. That sentence stayed with him. Days became weeks. Laughter began to slip into their conversations, surprising them both. He teased her about how serious she looked when counting money. She teased him about how he always ate too slowly, as if afraid the food might disappear. When business slowed, they shared meals. When rain threatened, they watched the sky together. When she packed up for the night, he helped carry light items, never overstepping, never assuming. Love did not arrive loudly. It did not announce itself. Grew in pauses, in shared glances, in the way they remembered small details about each other without trying. Amara began to look for him in the crowd without realizing it. She noticed how her mood lifted when she saw his familiar figure approaching. How silence felt heavier on days he didn't come. She loved him believing he had little to offer but honesty. Adebayo loved her knowing she offered something priceless. One evening, as the street settled into quiet and the air cooled, Amara spoke about her dream again, but this time with less hesitation. "One day," she said, eyes shining softly, "I want a place where people can come and feel at home. Not fancy. Just warm." Adebayo smiled. "That sounds like something worth building," he said. She laughed lightly. "Dreams are free," she replied. "Building them is expensive." He didn't argue, because for the first time money felt irrelevant. There were moments when the truth pressed hard against his chest, moments when he almost confessed everything. But fear held him back. Fear that her smile would change. Fear that her kindness would retreat. So he stayed quiet. And in that quiet, something sacred formed. They loved without titles, without promises, without names that carried weight. And for the first time in his life, Adebayo felt something he had never purchased, negotiated, or earned. He felt rich. Not because of what he had, but because of who he was becoming. The city streets had their own rhythm, a pulse that never stopped. Vendors shouted, cars honked, and life moved forward as if nothing else mattered. But sometimes the past doesn't wait for the present to be ready. Adebayo had thought he had stepped out of his old life. He had thought that by walking away from wealth, power, and recognition, he could finally discover what truly mattered. For weeks, he had found solace in anonymity. The marketplace had become a refuge, a place where he could sit quietly, eat without judgment, and laugh without the weight of expectation. Amara's presence had been a gentle anchor, a reminder that human connection could exist without contracts, without power, without pretense. But the past does not forget. It waits patiently, quietly, until it decides to return. That afternoon, a deep rumble rolled across the marketplace. At first, people thought it was the usual traffic, but the sound was different this time. Heavy engines, low and controlled, echoing like a warning. One by one, black SUVs appeared at the edge of the street, gleaming under the harsh sunlight, tinted windows hiding the eyes of those inside. A hush fell over the market. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Shoppers froze with bags in hand. Children stopped running. Stall owners stared at the approaching vehicles as if they had seen a phantom walk through. And then, from the middle SUV, a figure emerged. Catchy. Every step she took was measured, deliberate. Her heels clicked against the uneven pavement as though she belonged in a ballroom rather than a dusty market. Gold bracelets caught the sunlight, glittering sharply, a stark contrast to the humble surroundings. Dark glasses concealed her gaze, but her posture radiated authority and quiet menace. She had come looking for him, and she would not leave until she had found what she wanted. Her eyes scanned the market methodically, and then, she saw him, Adebayo, sitting beside a modest wooden food stall, laughing softly at something Amara had said. Dirty clothes, unkempt, unrecognizable. A man who had vanished from her world without a trace, now appearing in one she considered beneath him. Shock froze her in place. For a heartbeat, the marketplace ceased to exist except for the man she had been chasing. She had followed rumors, whispers, tips from friends, and yet, nothing had prepared her for this sight. "He can't be," she whispered almost to herself. But every instinct, every memory of the man she once knew, screamed the truth. He was here. And he had chosen to disappear. Later that night, when the streets had emptied and the market's lights flickered faintly, Nkechi approached Amara. She moved with the calm precision of someone used to control. "The man you love," she said, her voice cold but steady, "is not who you think he is. He is a billionaire, Adebayo Kingston, one of the richest men in the country. And he belongs in my world, not here." Amara froze, hands clutching her apron. She stared at Nkechi, trying to measure the truth in her words. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Nkechi's lips tightened. "I don't lie. You should know the truth before it's too late." Amara's laugh was soft, almost incredulous. "No," she said. "You must be mistaken. He's just a kind man. That's all. He's real. And that's enough." But doubt had already begun to creep into her mind. The next evening, the reality of Adebayo's choice began to press against him like a weight he hadn't anticipated. Hunger gnawed at him. Nights on cold pavements had left his body weak. The strain of hiding, pretending, and living between two worlds was wearing him down. He walked along the roadside slowly, his head heavy, legs trembling with exhaustion. The energy that once made him unstoppable in boardrooms now deserted him. And then, without warning, his body could take no more. His vision blurred. His steps faltered. He stumbled and collapsed, the pavement scraping his palms, his breath shallow. Chaos erupted around him. Shouts filled the air. People ran forward, some to help, some to gawk. The black SUVs returned, faster this time, engines roaring with urgency. Armed guards jumped out, scanning the crowd for threats. Doctors and paramedics rushed forward, medical kits in hand. Within minutes, the beggar, the man who had once been untouchable and now unrecognized, was lifted carefully into a luxury vehicle. Every movement was precise, orchestrated, and terrifying in its speed. Amara watched from the edge of the street, frozen. Her heart raced. Her hands shook. She could barely breathe as the scene unfolded before her eyes. By morning, the city roared louder than ever. Every screen, every newsstand, every digital platform blazed with the same headline. "Billionaire Adebayo Kingston found after weeks of disappearance." Amara stood in front of a shop window, the screen reflecting her own disbelief. Clean, polished, powerful, untouchable. Not the man who had sat beside her, laughed with her, and shared the simplest moments of life. The truth hit her chest like a hammer. "So, it was all a lie," she whispered, voice breaking, tears beginning to fall. Her knees weakened. The laughter, the kindness, the intimacy of the past weeks now seemed fragile, like a dream that had been stolen away. And yet, beneath the ache of betrayal, a question burned. Had she loved the man she thought she knew? Or the man who had shown her what love could feel like without wealth, without fame, without power? The answer was not yet clear. All she knew was that the world had changed overnight. And so had her heart. Days passed since the city had erupted with the news of Adebayo Kingston's return. Screens had shown his polished face, interviews had circulated, and whispers of his disappearance filled every corner of the urban landscape. But none of it mattered to Adebayo. None of it mattered to him as he stood before the small, humble doorway of the woman who had unknowingly changed everything about him. He had left behind his suits, his watches, his cars, the private jets waiting at quiet runways. He had left behind the name that opened borders and commanded attention. He had left it all, not to prove a point, not to teach a lesson, but to find the one thing he had never possessed, a love that belonged to him and him alone. The night air was cool and scented faintly with the smoke of street fires and simmering stews. Lanterns swayed gently in the breeze along the narrow lane, casting shadows that danced softly across cracked walls. It was quiet, peaceful, almost fragile, the perfect setting for honesty, for vulnerability. Amara's hands froze as she opened the door. She did not speak at first, only stared. The man who had once been unrecognizable beside her stall now stood clean, calm, composed. But no wealth gleamed from him. There were no guards, no press, no announcements. Only him. He knelt before her. The gesture was simple, humble, and yet it carried the weight of everything he had endured. The nights alone, the hunger, the fear, the doubt, and the longing for something real. "I hid my identity because I was afraid," he began, his voice trembling just enough to reveal the truth beneath the strength he had always shown the world. "Afraid that people would love me for what I had, not who I was. Afraid that even you would see the wrong side of me." Amara's lips trembled. She had expected pride, excuses, maybe charm. But not this. This honesty, this naked admission of fear and humility. "You loved me when you thought I had nothing," he continued. "And that mattered more than anything else." Tears slid down her cheeks, warm and unrestrained. She had spent nights wondering if her heart had been fooled. She had questioned herself, wondered if love built on kindness could survive the weight of truth. Now the answer was standing before her. "You let me love you without knowing everything," she whispered, voice soft, almost broken. "You let me love who I thought you were." "I let the world judge me," he said, gently lifting her hands. "But you saved me. You showed me what it meant to be seen, to be cared for, to be human." Silence fell between them. Not an uncomfortable silence, but the kind that stretches across time, where words are unnecessary, where eyes speak everything the heart wants to say. Then she asked the question that had been quietly echoing in her mind for weeks. "If you lost everything tomorrow, would you still choose me?" He took both her hands in his, gripping them firmly yet tenderly. His gaze never wavered. "I already did," he said. The moment felt suspended in time. The world outside, the traffic, the chatter, the distant lights, ceased to exist. There was only truth, only trust, only two souls that had found one another in the chaos of life. Weeks passed, and life began to weave itself around their newfound reality. Months later they married. There were no grand ceremonies. No palaces or red carpets. The wedding was simple, quiet, intimate, filled with the laughter of neighbors and friends who had watched their story unfold. The ceremony took place in the very market where they had first met. The same tables, the same dusty roads, now sparkling faintly with new decorations and flowers, gifted by those whose hearts they had touched along the way. Adebayo redirected his fortune, not to impress the world, not to dazzle with extravagance, but to uplift it. He funded small businesses for young entrepreneurs, improved the neighborhood infrastructure, and supported those who, like Amara, had worked tirelessly to survive. His wealth became a tool for compassion, not a symbol of status. Amara, for her part, learned the deepest lesson life had offered her. That love, when genuine, looks first at the soul, not at wealth, not at appearances. She had loved a man who seemed like a beggar, and in that love she had discovered everything. Even in quiet moments, long after the vows were exchanged and celebrations faded, they would sit together at her small food stand, hands entwined, smiles shared, laughter spilling softly into the streets. The smell of rice, stew, and fresh bread mingled with the scent of the city, a reminder of where they had begun and how far they had come. Adebayo often thought about the night he had first disappeared, about the emptiness that had driven him to seek the truth of himself. And in every glance at Amara, in every shared smile, in every moment where they could just be without pretense, he realized the wealth he had once prized was nothing compared to the treasure he had finally found. A love untainted by expectation, a connection unmeasured by money, a life made rich by humanity. And so, in the heart of a city that never slept, two hearts had discovered a quiet eternity. Not built on fortune, not built on power, not built on pretense, but built on truth, kindness, and the courage to be vulnerable. For the first time, Adebayo Kingston understood fully that everything he had ever wanted, everything he had ever truly needed, was right there in her hands, in her smile, and in the life they were creating together. It was more than wealth. It was more than status. It was love. And it was enough. If you enjoyed this story, please give this video a like. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next captivating story filled with love, lessons, and unforgettable moments. Until our next story. Keep your heart open and your imagination alive.